The Harrington estate sat at the end of Magnolia Drive like a crown dropped carelessly into the Georgia hills, all soaring glass and pale stone, surrounded by 12 acres of manicured grounds that a team of landscapers maintained with the kind of obsessive precision that only old money and newer billions could afford. Iron gates, ornate and imposing, separated the property from the rest of the world, and that separation was exactly how Ethan Harrington preferred it. At 33, Ethan had already built and sold 2 tech companies, launched a third that was now valued at somewhere north of $4 billion, and appeared on the covers of enough magazines that his publicist had started turning down requests. He had the jaw of someone who had been called handsome so many times he'd stopped hearing it, the posture of someone who had never truly relaxed in a room full of people, and the eyes of someone who had learned very early that the world would take from you everything you weren't careful enough to protect. He was not unkind, exactly. He paid his staff well, exceptionally well, by any standard. He didn't raise his voice, didn't make unreasonable demands, didn't treat people with the casual cruelty that some men in his position seemed to consider a birthright. But he was distant, controlled. His estate ran like a machine, and he liked it that way. Every morning began with a 6 o'clock run, followed by a cold shower, followed by a breakfast he ate alone at a table built for 14. His calendar was a fortress of meetings and obligations, and his personal life was something he had quietly stopped tending to years ago, the way you stop watering a plant you've already decided you don't have time for. His housekeeper of 7 years, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, had once told him gently that the house felt more like a hotel than a home. He had smiled at that, a polite, practiced smile, and told her he appreciated the feedback. He had not changed anything. So when Sophia Reyes arrived at the Harrington estate on a Tuesday morning in late April, she arrived as most employees did, through the service entrance, paperwork in hand, prepared to be invisible. Sophia was 28 years old, and she carried herself with the particular dignity of someone who had learned to hold their head up not because life had been easy, but because they had decided a long time ago that it wasn't going to break them. She was slender and dark-haired, with warm brown eyes that held something that could only be called quiet fire, a steadiness that went deeper than composure. She wore her uniform, a pressed gray dress that Mrs. Chun had mailed to her the week before, and she wore it like she'd worn it her whole life. There was no nervousness in her handshake, no apology in her voice when she introduced herself. What she didn't mention during that introduction, what she had been anxious about mentioning, had rehearsed a dozen ways to explain, had lost sleep over in the small apartment she shared with her daughter 3 towns over, was Marisol. Marisol Reyes was 3 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her late father's stubborn chin, and a personality so large it seemed physically impossible that it fit inside a body that still needed help climbing into bed. She was curious about everything, afraid of almost nothing, and had recently discovered that the world contained an infinite supply of surfaces that could be drawn on. Crayons were her medium of choice, though she had been known to use markers, pens, and on one memorable occasion, blueberry jam. Sophia's previous employer had let her bring Marisol to work 3 days a week, a mercy that had made the whole arrangement possible, since daycare for a toddler cost more than Sophia was comfortable admitting to herself. When that family relocated to Boston, they'd offered to take Sophia with them. She had stood in their kitchen, Marisol on her hip, and felt the particular grief of a door closing that you can't afford to hold open. She had said no. Her mother's grave was here. Her sister was here. Her daughter's whole world was here. Mrs. Chun had not promised anything about Marisol during the hiring process. She had said she would see what she could do, which Sophia understood to mean that she would ask Mr. Harrington, which meant there was a real chance the answer would be no. She had prepared herself for no. She had a backup plan, a neighbor who could watch Marisol on short notice, a patchwork arrangement that would strain her schedule and her budget and her nerves simultaneously. She had decided to ask only if it became absolutely necessary, to prove herself first, to become so quietly indispensable that by the time the question came up, the answer would already feel obvious. What she had not planned for was the Thursday morning, exactly 11 days into her employment, when her neighbor called at 6:45 with a fever of 102 and a voice full of apology, and Sophia stood in her kitchen holding the phone and looking at Marisol, who was eating cereal in her pajamas and humming to herself with the contentment of someone who had absolutely no idea she was a complication. She had called Mrs. Chun with her heart in her throat. Mrs. Chun had listened, sighed the sigh of a woman who had managed this estate through considerably worse crises, and said, "Bring her. We'll figure it out. But keep her quiet and keep her out of Mr. Harrington's way. He's working from home today." Sophia had dressed Marisol in her best outfit, a yellow dress with white daisies that made her look like a small, solemn sunflower, and explained on the drive over, in the patient, precise way she had developed for communicating important information to a 3-year-old, that they were going somewhere very special, that Mama had to work, that Marisol needed to be a good girl and stay where Mama could see her, and absolutely, positively, under no circumstances touch anything. Marisol had listened to all of this with apparent seriousness, her small face arranged in an expression of mature understanding. She had then immediately, upon entering the estate staff break room, discovered a set of colored markers in an open supply drawer, picked up the blue one, and looked around the room with the quiet, purposeful energy of an artist who had just been handed a blank canvas. Sophia hadn't seen it happen. She had been speaking with Mrs. Chun in the hallway, getting her assignments for the day, her voice low and professional, her gratitude genuine but contained. She had been inside the room for no more than 4 minutes. 4 minutes was, it turned out, exactly enough time for a determined 3-year-old with a blue marker to find a dress shirt that had been left draped over the back of a chair, waiting to be ironed. A shirt that was, as Sophia would discover with a lurch of pure cold terror, not just any shirt, but a Thomas pink shirt that probably cost more than her monthly grocery bill, and cover the left sleeve, the front placket, and a significant portion of the collar with what appeared to be a drawing of either a house or a boat, surrounded by 7 lopsided stars and what Marisol would later describe, with great confidence, as the moon and also a dog. Sophia found her daughter standing over the shirt with the uncomplicated pride of someone who has just completed a masterpiece. The marker was still in her hand. Her dress was clean. She looked up at her mother with big, bright eyes. "Mama," she said happily, "I made pretty." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture to it, the kind you can feel pressing against your skin. Sophia stood in the doorway of the break room and looked at her daughter, and looked at the shirt, and felt the specific, stomach-dropping quality of a disaster that cannot be undone, only survived. She crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched down to Marisol's level, taking the marker gently from her hand, keeping her voice carefully steady, because Marisol was watching her face with the attentiveness that all small children have for their mother's expressions, reading it like a weather forecast. "Baby," Sophia said, very quietly, "what did you draw on?" Marisol pointed at the shirt with one small finger. "That blanket." "That's not a blanket, sweetheart." Sophia picked up the shirt and turned it over in her hands, and the full scope of the damage made her close her eyes for just 1 second. The blue ink had soaked into the cotton in the thorough, committed way that marker ink always did, spreading at the edges, blooming slightly from the fibers, permanent in the way that only truly inconvenient things ever were. The stars were charming, objectively. Under any other circumstances, on any other surface, Sophia might have even smiled at them. Marisol's drawings always had this earnest, concentrated quality, like she was trying very hard to communicate something important and just didn't quite have the technical skills yet. You could see the effort in every line. You could see the love. But this was not a piece of paper. This was not the construction paper Sophia kept in a drawer at home specifically for Marisol's artistic ambitions. This was a man's shirt. This was her employer's shirt. This was the kind of shirt that came in a box, wrapped in tissue paper, with a card inside that listed its material composition in 2 languages. Sophia set the shirt down on the table and stood up and pressed her hands flat against the surface and breathed. She had 2 options, and she could see them both clearly. She could go to Mrs. Chun right now and confess everything, offer to pay for the shirt, somehow over time quietly, and face whatever came next with the same dignity she had been carrying around since she was 19 years old, and realize that dignity was sometimes the only currency she had. Or she could try to fix it herself. First, before anyone knew. Before it became a conversation she had to have with an employer she had been trying so carefully to impress. The second option was not a serious option. She knew that. Sophia was not someone who ran from things, and she was not going to start now. But she allowed herself 30 seconds of wanting it to be possible before she let it go. What she did not expect, what she absolutely could not have predicted, was Marisol. While Sophia had been standing at the table with her hands pressed flat and her thoughts moving rapidly through her options, Marisol had been watching her mother's face and processing what she saw there with the seriousness that 3-year-olds sometimes surprised you with. She had seen worry. She understood, in the imperfect but genuine way that small children understand things, that she had caused it. She didn't have the words for guilt yet. Not the way adults did, but she had something close to it, a heaviness in her chest, a sense that something needed to be made right. She had also watched her mother wash things. She had watched her fill sinks and use soap and scrub, had watched the careful, methodical attention her mother brought to every task, had watched things go in dirty and come out clean. She understood washing the way she understood most domestic rituals, through a mixture of observation and the deep instinctive mimicry of a child who spent most of her time watching the most competent person she knew move through the world. Sophia had turned away for just a moment, just long enough to reach for her phone and pull up the contact for Mrs. Chun, steeling herself for the call, when she heard the sound of running water. She turned around. Marisol had pushed her small step stool, the one Sophia carried everywhere because Marisol could not reach most sinks without it, up to the break room's utility sink. She had climbed up. She had turned on the cold water with both hands, the way she'd seen her mother do. She had picked up the shirt, which was significantly larger than she was, and she had bundled it in her arms with the focused determination of someone completing an important assignment, and she had put it under the water. She was scrubbing it with her hands, rubbing the fabric together in small, concentrated circles over the blue marks, her tiny face set with an expression of profound effort. Water was soaking her yellow daisy dress. Her hair was getting wet at the edges. She didn't seem to notice. She was working. Sophia's throat closed. She stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it was, watching her daughter try to fix what she had broken. This small, serious, wet child standing on her step stool at the sink with a billionaire's dress shirt in her hands, scrubbing with all the earnest inadequacy of someone who doesn't know yet that some things can't be rubbed out, but who has decided that trying is still the right thing to do. Marisol looked up and saw her mother watching. She did not look caught. She looked determined. She pointed at the shirt, then at her own chest. "I fix it, Mama," she said. "I make it clean." Sophia pressed her hand over her mouth. She would not cry. She was not going to cry in the break room of her employer's estate 11 days into a job she desperately needed. She was not going to do that. She breathed. She walked to the sink. She put her hands gently on Marisol's shoulders and looked at her daughter's face, The concentration there, the goodness of it, the small pure goodness of a child who had done something wrong and immediately, instinctively, tried to make it right, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she didn't have a name for. "Baby," she said softly, "come here." She lifted Marisol off the step stool and held her, wet dress and all, and Marisol wrapped her arms around her mother's neck and said, into her collar, "I fix it." "You tried," Sophia whispered. "You really tried." What neither of them knew, what Sophia had absolutely no way of knowing, was that the break room door had been open the entire time, and that Ethan Harrington, who had come downstairs 20 minutes earlier than his usual schedule because he'd forgotten to charge his laptop and needed the charger from the kitchen cabinet, had stopped in the hallway outside that door approximately 45 seconds after Marisol climbed onto her step stool. He had been standing there in silence ever since. He had watched the whole thing. The child discovering the damage she'd caused. The child looking at her mother's worried face and deciding, without being asked, without being told, that she needed to try to fix it. The small hands on the wet fabric. The scrubbing. The look of pure, earnest intention on a 3-year-old face. Ethan Harrington was not a man who was easily moved. He had built a career on the ability to observe human behavior without being swept away by it, to see the angles and the motivations and the patterns without letting sentiment cloud his judgment. He had sat across from crying people in boardrooms and felt nothing. He had received news that would have wrecked other men and simply recalibrated. But he was standing in a hallway outside his break room, and there was something happening in his chest that he did not immediately have a framework for. It was not pity. It wasn't quite admiration, though there was some of that. It was something simpler and older than either of those things. It was the feeling of watching someone be genuinely good, small and imperfect and soaking wet and genuinely, uncomplicatedly good, and being reminded, without warning, that such a thing existed in the world. He stood there for another long moment. Then he straightened up, very quietly, and walked back down the hallway the way he'd come. He did not get his laptop charger. He didn't need it as much as he'd thought. Ethan spent the next 2 hours in his home office, ostensibly reviewing quarterly projections from his logistics division, and actually staring at the same paragraph for 20 minutes at a time before realizing he hadn't absorbed a single word of it. This bothered him. His concentration was not something that failed on him. It was one of the things he had always been able to count on, that particular quality of focused attention that could shut out every peripheral distraction and drive through a problem like a blade, through still water. It had made him extraordinary at his work, and he was self-aware enough to acknowledge fairly poor company at most other things. He had been told by 2 separate women at 2 separate points in his life that being with him felt like being adjacent to someone who was always somewhere else. He had understood what they meant. He had not known what to do with it. But right now, in his office, with $4 billion worth of logistical complexity waiting for his attention, he could not stop thinking about a 3-year-old girl and a wet dress shirt and the look on her face when she said, "I fix it." He had employees with MBAs from institutions that charged $200,000 for the privilege who did not demonstrate that quality of instinctive accountability. He had sat in meetings where grown adults with expensive haircuts and impressive titles had spent 45 minutes explaining, with great creativity and no small amount of corporate language, why a mistake was not really their mistake. He had watched people contort themselves into extraordinary logical shapes to avoid the simple dignity of saying, "I did this, and I am trying to make it right." And here was a child, 3 years old, not yet entirely sure what a shirt was, who had looked at what she'd done and simply, immediately, tried to fix it. He picked up his phone and called Mrs. Chun. "The shirt in the break room," he said when she answered. There was a pause. Then, "Mr. Harrington, I can explain." "I don't need an explanation." He kept his voice even, measured. He was aware that he sounded, as he often did, like he was conducting a business call. He didn't know how to sound like he wasn't. I need you to tell me about the new employee. Sophia. Her situation. Another pause, this one different in quality, the pause of someone recalibrating. She's excellent, Mr. Harrington. Truly. She's been here less than 2 weeks, and she's already. I know she's excellent. I'm asking about her situation. The child. Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was careful. Her daughter's name is Marisol. She's 3. Sophia is a single mother. Her husband passed away about 18 months ago. A car accident. She's been managing on her own since then. Her childcare arrangement fell through this morning, which is why Marisol is here today. It won't be a regular occurrence. Sophia was very clear about that. Ethan turned this over in his mind. 18 months. A toddler. On her own. What was her husband's name? He didn't know why he asked. It felt important suddenly to know. Marco, Mrs. Chen said after a moment. Marco Reyes. Ethan nodded, though he was alone in the room and no one could see it. He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the grounds below, where a gardener was trimming the hedges along the south wall with metronomic patience. Is the child still here? Yes. She's with Sophia in the laundry room. She's trying to treat the shirt, Mr. Harrington. She came to me immediately to report it, and she's been working on it for the past hour. She wanted me to tell you that she intends to pay for a replacement regardless of whether the stain comes out. She was very specific about that. Something moved through him. Tell her to stop. Pardon. Tell her to stop working on the shirt. He paused. And tell her I'd like to speak with her. Not about the shirt. Just tell her to come to my office when she has a moment. And she can bring the child. The pause this time was the longest yet. Ethan could hear in it the particular quality of Mrs. Chen recalibrating everything she thought she knew about this morning. Of course, Mr. Harrington, she said finally, in a voice that was professionally neutral and possibly, faintly, amused. He hung up and looked around his office, at the clean lines of it, the deliberate emptiness, the total absence of anything that hadn't been placed there for a specific functional purpose. No photographs. No small personal objects. Just the architecture of productivity arranged to minimize distraction and maximize output. He had designed this room himself. He had been very proud of it. Looking at it now, he felt something he could only describe as the faint awareness of a lack, the way you sometimes notice silence only when something interrupts it and you realize, in the interruption, that the silence had always been there. Sophia knocked on his office door 12 minutes later. He had tracked the time without meaning to. She came in composed. That was the first thing he noticed, the composure which was not the brittle, performative composure of someone holding themselves together by an act of will, but something more settled and genuine, the composure of someone who had decided long ago to meet things as they came rather than flinch from them. She was holding Marisol on her hip, Marisol, whose yellow dress was still slightly damp at the front and whose eyes went immediately and unapologetically wide at the size of the room. Mr. Harrington, Sophia said. Her voice was steady. I want to start by apologizing. I take full responsibility for. Sit down, he said. And then, because that had come out with more authority than he'd intended, please, if you'd like. Sophia looked at him for a moment, assessing something. Then she crossed the room and sat in the chair across from his desk, settling Marisol on her lap. Marisol looked at Ethan with the frank, unembarrassed curiosity of someone who has not yet learned that staring is rude. She looked at his face, his desk, the bookshelves behind him, and then back at his face. Then she pointed at him. Who are you? She asked. Sophia's composure flickered. He caught a quick, involuntary tension in her jaw. But before she could redirect, He leaned forward slightly and looked at Marisol directly. "I'm Ethan," he said. "I live here." Marisol considered this. "Do you have toys?" "Marisol," Sophia said quietly. "No," Ethan said. "I don't." He paused. "I probably should." Something shifted in the room. A very small amount, like a door opening just slightly. Sophia looked at him with the careful, measuring look of someone trying to determine whether they are being managed or whether something genuine is happening. He met her eyes. "I saw her," he said simply. "At the sink. I was in the hallway. I wasn't trying to listen, but I saw her." He paused. "She was trying to wash it." Sophia's eyes softened before she could stop them. He watched it happen, that involuntary softening, and something in his chest responded to it in a way he did not analyze. "She knew she'd upset me," she said. Her voice was quieter now, less formal. "She always knows. She's been like that since she was barely old enough to read faces." "How old is she?" 3. "She'll be 4 in September." He looked at Marisol, who had lost interest in him temporarily and was examining the edge of Sophia's sleeve with concentrated attention. "She's remarkable," he said, and meant it in the plain, specific way that he almost never meant the polite things he said. What she did, the accountability of it, the instinct to try and repair, that's not a small thing. In anyone. Sophia held very still for a moment. When she looked at him again, something had changed in her expression, a guardedness giving way, slightly, to something more undefended. "She gets that from her father," she said. And then, as if the words had surprised her by coming out, "He was like that. Whatever he broke, he fixed. Whatever he said wrong, he came back and said it right. He never let things sit." The past tense landed in the room between them. Ethan did not look away from her. He did not fill the silence with something convenient. "Mrs. Chen told me," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Sophia nodded once. A small, contained nod that held everything she wasn't going to say in this office, in this conversation, in front of this man she'd known for 11 days. "Thank you," she said. Marisol, who had finished her examination of Sophia's sleeve, looked up at Ethan. "I draw it on your shirt," she said, with the absolute candor of someone who has not yet learned the art of strategic omission. "I know," Ethan said. "I tried to wash it." Her brow furrowed slightly. "But it didn't come off." "That's okay." She looked at him with great seriousness. "Are you mad?" Ethan Harrington, who had not been asked that question by anyone in longer than he could remember, who lived in a world where people managed his emotional state from a careful distance, where no one ever asked him directly what he felt because the direct question implied a right to the answer, felt something happen behind his sternum that was unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable he was discovering something he wanted to make stop. "No," he said. "I'm not mad." Marisol looked at him for another long moment. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and leaned back against her mother with the boneless ease of someone who has concluded that a situation is resolved and can now be relaxed about. Ethan looked at Sophia. Sophia looked at him. "The shirt doesn't matter," he said. "It matters to me," she said. "That's why it doesn't matter to me," he said. And he said it with the particular stillness of someone who means exactly what they say and not one word more. April turned into May in the way that Georgia springs always did. Not gradually, but suddenly, as if someone had made a decision overnight and the whole landscape had agreed to it by morning. The dogwoods along Magnolia Drive finished their bloom and dropped their petals in drifts of white and pale pink, and the air took on that thick, honeyed quality that felt like breathing something you could almost eat. Marisol had decided she liked it here. This had not been part of anyone's plan. Sophia had intended the Thursday in April to be a one-time exception, a single morning where her daughter sat quietly in the break room and colored on paper while her mother worked, and no one was inconvenienced, and the whole thing was never mentioned again. She had arranged backup childcare. She had reinforced with Marisol multiple times and with great seriousness the rules about what could and could not be drawn on. She had done everything right. Ethan Harrington had asked Mrs. Chun on the Friday following that Thursday whether there was a way to make the arrangement more permanent. Mrs. Chun had relayed this to Sophia with an expression that she clearly worked very hard to keep neutral. Sophia had stood in the kitchen for a long moment and then said, very carefully, that she didn't want special treatment, that she didn't want to be a burden on the household, that she understood completely if it wasn't practical. Mrs. Chun had said, with the particular patience of a woman who had managed this estate for 7 years and had learned to read between the lines of everything Ethan Harrington said and did not say, that Mr. Harrington had specifically used the word permanent, and that in her experience, when he used words like that, he meant them. So Marisol came to the Harrington estate 3 days a week, and she did it with the proprietary ease of someone who has decided, without consulting anyone, that a place belongs to her. She had a corner of the staff break room that had been quietly outfitted with a small table and a set of washable markers, specifically washable, a detail that Sophia had specified and that had appeared without fanfare within 24 hours. She had opinions about the garden, which she communicated to the landscapers with gestures and a running commentary that they had begun to find genuinely charming. She had identified the kitchen as a place of great interest and had negotiated with the estate's chef, a French-trained man named Gerald who had initially approached the presence of a toddler in his kitchen with the wariness of someone who has worked very hard to achieve a particular standard of order, a standing invitation to sit at the kitchen island on Tuesday mornings and receive small tastes of whatever he was preparing. Gerald, who had no children and had not previously considered whether he wanted them, had started making small extra portions of things without acknowledging that he was doing it. And Ethan had started coming downstairs at irregular times. This was noticed by Mrs. Chun. It was possibly noticed by Sophia, though she gave no sign of it. It was absolutely noticed by Marisol, who had simply incorporated him into her understanding of the place the way she incorporated everything, as a feature of the landscape, something that was there, and therefore worth investigating. She had learned his name. She used it freely. Ethan came out of her mouth with the complete lack of ceremony that 3-year-olds applied to all proper nouns, and the first time she'd said it in his presence, calling to him across the hallway, having spotted him from the kitchen doorway. He had stopped walking and turned around with an expression that Mrs. Chun, watching from the other end of the hall, would later describe as stunned, in the way you are stunned by something you had forgotten you were capable of wanting. He had crouched down to her level. He had done it with the slight awkwardness of someone who didn't do it often, who didn't quite know where to put his hands or how to arrange his face, and who was trying too hard to seem natural and therefore seemed the opposite. Marisol had looked at him with her frank, enormous eyes and said, "I made a picture. Come see." He had gone to see the picture. It was a drawing of what she described as the garden but with a dragon, done in green and orange washable marker on the paper her mother had laid out for her. The dragon was indistinguishable from a large dog. The garden was a series of vertical lines that could have been grass or possibly trees or possibly a fence. It had enormous energy and almost no representational accuracy, and something about it, the boldness of the lines, the commitment of it, made him think of the first PowerPoint he'd made at 22, the one that had convinced his first investor to take a chance on him. That presentation had also been more energy than precision. It had also, somehow, gotten its point across. "That's very good," he said, and meant it. Marisol nodded with the unashamed confidence of someone who has not yet encountered a critic. "You can have it," she said. "It can go on your wall." He looked at her. "You're sure?" She shrugged with one shoulder, a gesture so precise in its casual generosity that it landed somewhere behind his ribs. "You don't have any pictures," she said. "I saw." He took the picture home, which is to say, upstairs to his office. He set it on his desk. He moved it twice, trying different positions, before settling on propping it against the lamp on the right side of the desk where he could see it from his chair. He sat back and looked at it for a moment, this lopsided dragon in a garden, drawn by a 3-year-old who had decided without being asked that his walls were too bare. He left it there. Sophia noticed it when she came to clean his office 3 days later. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she came in, and she looked at the drawing against the lamp, and then she looked at the room, the same clean lines, the deliberate emptiness, and something happened to her expression that was private and complicated and not meant to be seen. She cleaned the room without touching the drawing. She was very precise about it. She had been in this house for 6 weeks now, and she knew things about it that she had not expected to know. She knew that Ethan Harrington ate breakfast alone every morning at a table built for 14, and that he ate the same thing every day, black coffee, 2 eggs, wheat toast, with the mechanical efficiency of someone refueling rather than enjoying. She knew that he worked until 10 or 11 most nights, that he slept 4 hours less than any doctor would recommend, that he had not had a personal visitor of any kind since she'd started working there. She knew that he had a shelf of books in his office that were clearly red, spines cracked, corners bent, and that most of them were histories, biographies of builders and makers, men and women who had started with nothing and constructed something from the nothing through force of will. She knew, in the way that people who pay attention always know things about the lives they move through, that he was lonely. Not in the dramatic, obvious way of someone who has been abandoned. In the quiet, structural way of someone who has built their life according to a set of priorities that made no room for the kind of connection that requires you to be fully present, fully seen, fully somewhere other than inside your own competence. She did not say any of this to him. It was not hers to say. But she thought about it. In the honest, unguarded way she thought about things in the car on the way home, with Marisol asleep in the car seat behind her. She thought about the drawing on his desk. She thought about the way he had crouched down to Marisol's level with that careful, effortful awkwardness. She thought about the moment in his office, the first morning, when he had said "that's why it doesn't matter to me," and the stillness in his face when he'd said it. She thought about Marco, about the specific quality of Marco's goodness, the way he fixed things, the way he never let things sit. She had been measuring men against that quality without knowing she was doing it, the way you measure distances against a unit you've internalized so completely you've forgotten it's a standard. She pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment in the quiet car, listening to Marisol breathe. She was not going to be foolish about this. She was not going to mistake proximity for meaning or kindness for something it wasn't. She was 28 years old and she had a daughter and a job she needed and a life she had built on the reliable foundation of her own clarity about what was real and what she was simply hoping was real. But the drawing was on his desk, and he had not touched it, and she did not know what to do with that. The accident happened on a Wednesday evening in early June, which was the kind of accident that wasn't an accident at all. That was instead the convergence of a series of perfectly ordinary circumstances into something that would alter the geometry of 3 people's lives so completely that they would later mark time by it. Sophia had stayed late. It happened sometimes. An event, a special circumstance, something in the estate's schedule that required extra hands. That evening it had been a small dinner Ethan was hosting for a board member and his wife, and Mrs. Chun had asked Sophia to stay to help with the setup and initial service, and Sophia had arranged for her neighbor, recovered fully from her February fever, to pick up Marisol from daycare and keep her until Sophia's return. The dinner had gone smoothly. The board member and his wife had come and gone. The kitchen was restored to Gerald's exacting standards. It was 9:30 when Sophia carried the last of the dinner linens to the laundry room, and she was thinking about Marisol, thinking about what her neighbor had said on a quick text check-in, that Marisol was asleep already, worn out from an afternoon in the yard, and she was not thinking about the step stool that had been moved from its usual position near the utility sink. She went down in the laundry room doorway, hard, her foot catching the stool at an angle that twisted her ankle in a way that produced a sound she felt in her teeth. She caught herself on the doorframe, both hands slamming against the wood, saving herself from going all the way down, but the ankle had already done what it was going to do, and when she put weight on it, the pain was immediate and specific and serious. She stood in the doorway, breathing. She was good at this, breathing through things. She had had practice. The linens were in a pile on the floor. She had dropped them when she'd caught herself. She was going to need to pick them up. She was going to need to put them in the machine. She was going to need to walk to her car in the parking area and drive 40 minutes home. She took one step, and the ankle informed her, with great precision, that she was not going to be doing any of those things easily. Hey. She turned around. Ethan was in the hallway behind her. He'd clearly heard the impact, had come from the direction of his office, still in his dress shirt from the dinner, collar open now, sleeves pushed up. He looked at her face, then down at her foot, then back at her face. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine, Sophia." He said her name, just her name, quietly and without any harshness, and something in the way he said it, like he actually meant it, like he was actually asking her to stop for a moment and let someone help, reached past her defenses before she'd had time to raise them. She sat down on the step stool that had betrayed her. He crouched in front of her, this time without awkwardness, with a directness and ease that was different from the careful performance he'd brought to crouching down to Marisol's level, and looked at her ankle. He didn't ask permission. He gently, with his hands, moved her ankle through a small rotation, watching her face. "Tell me where it hurts," he said. She told him. He looked at the ankle, already beginning to swell, the skin tight and tender, and shook his head. "You need ice and elevation. You shouldn't drive tonight." "I have to get home," she said. "Marisol is at your neighbor's. Mrs. Chin told me earlier. She's asleep." He was still looking at the ankle, his hands steady and careful. "She's fine for tonight." "You're not fine. You have a significant sprain, possibly worse. You can't diagnose." "I've had 3 of these," he said. 2 running, 1 on a hiking trail. "I know what they look like." He looked up at her. "There are 6 guest suites in this house, every one of them made up and empty. You're not driving tonight." Sophia looked at him. She was sitting on a step stool in a laundry room doorway with a sprained ankle and a pile of dropped linens and a man who had just used a tone of voice she had not heard from him before, direct and present in a way that was different from his normal precision, that contained something more personal in it, something that hadn't been there 11 days ago when she'd first walked in. "I don't want to impose," she said. And she meant it, but she also heard it as she said it as the automatic thing she said, the reflex of someone who had been managing alone for so long that accepting help had started to feel like a failure of character. Ethan heard it too. She could see that he did, could see the recognition in his face, the slight shift of understanding. "I know," he said. And then, "But you're hurt, and your daughter needs you functional. Let someone help. Let someone help." The simplicity of it. She had not been told that in 18 months. She had been offered help, carefully and kindly, by her sister, by her neighbors, by her mother's friends. But it had always come with something around it, pity, concern, the slight weight of someone watching to see if she was going to fall apart. This was different. This was said by someone who was not watching her for signs of fragility, but simply acknowledging a practical situation with the plain, unromantic clarity of a man who fixed things. She breathed out. "All right," she said. He helped her to the guest room. She did not need much help. She was capable on her own, and she made that clear, but he walked beside her, close enough that if she had needed to catch herself, his arm would have been there. He did not make a production of it. He did not hover. He simply walked beside her, and the intimacy of that, not the grand gesture but the plain, steady proximity, did something to her chest that she was not going to examine tonight. He brought her ice, a bag of it, wrapped in a towel, without her asking. He set it on the guest room side table and told her where the pain medication was in the bathroom cabinet and showed her how to use the room sound system in case she couldn't sleep. He stood at the door for a moment, hand on the doorframe, and looked at her, really looked at her, not the managed, professional look of an employer checking on an employee, but the direct look of someone who is seeing a person and knowing it. "Thank you," she said, "for all of this." He was quiet for a moment. "You do a lot here," he said. "You do more than I think you know." A pause. "And not just the work." She looked at him across the room. The guest suite was soft in the lamplight, all pale linen and warm wood, nothing like the cool precision of his office. He looked, in this light, like someone slightly different from the man she saw moving through the estate's public spaces, slightly less armored, slightly more present. "Good night, Ethan," she said. He had never heard his name in her voice before. She had always called him Mr. Harrington. He heard, in the departure from that, something that was not quite a declaration, but was not nothing either. A small opening of a door. "Good night," he said. And he closed the door behind him with the care of someone who is trying very hard not to want something that might not be his to want. He stood in the hallway for a moment afterward. The house was quiet around him, the big, managed, expensive quiet he had built and arranged and maintained. But it felt, tonight, like a different kind of quiet. Less controlled. Less empty. He had not engineered this. He had not planned it or calculated it or assessed it for risk and return the way he assessed everything. It had happened the way real things sometimes happened, when you were not paying attention, when a child drew on your shirt and tried to wash it with her small hands, when a woman said, "I fix it," and you thought, "Yes, exactly. That is exactly right." He walked back to his office. He looked at the drawing, the dragon in the garden, the lopsided stars, still propped against the lamp. He sat down in his chair and looked at it for a long time. The summer arrived and settled over the Harrington estate with the comfortable confidence of something that intends to stay. The days grew long and warm and unhurried, and the grounds took on the particular beauty of a landscape in its fullest expression: roses along the east wall, the lily pond in the south garden reflecting a sky that Georgia seemed to manufacture for the specific purpose of being reflected. Marisol had claimed the lily pond as a point of great personal interest. She stood at its edge 3 or 4 times a day on the days she was there, studying its surface with the absorbed attention of a scientist, occasionally narrating her observations to whoever happened to be standing nearby. The fish were named. She had named them herself, without anyone's input, and the names, Gerald, Purple, and Big, had been communicated to the actual Gerald with great seriousness and had been received by him with an expression that his face tried to make stern and absolutely failed to. It was at the Lily Pond, on an evening in late July, that Ethan found her alone. He had come to find Sophia. He did that now, sometimes, without manufacturing a reason, just appearing near wherever she was working with some peripheral justification that neither of them entirely believed. He had found her manner of moving through the estate calming. In some fundamental way he didn't analyze, the way you found a particular piece of music calming without knowing why it worked on you. But tonight Sophia was inside, finishing something in the east sitting room, and Marisol had apparently been sent to the garden with instructions to stay where the landscape crew could see her and had migrated to the pond. He walked across the lawn to her. She did not look up when he arrived but shifted slightly to her right, making room beside her, in the implicit way that said you can stand here if you want to. He stood there. Big is eating, Marisol informed him. Is she? He. Marisol corrected, with the gravity of someone managing important information. Big is a he. Gerald is a she. I see. They stood together in the evening light, the man and the child, watching the fish move through the dark water. The air smelled like grass and something floral, and the last heat of the day rising from the stone edging of the pond. A bird called from somewhere in the trees. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. Marisol put her hand in his. She just did it, unceremonious, natural, the way she did everything. Her small hand finding his bigger one and settling there, fingers wrapping around his with the complete, trusting confidence of someone who has decided, in whatever calculation 3-year-olds make about these things, that a person is safe. He looked down at her hand. He looked at her profile, the concentrated face, watching the fish, the late light catching the ends of her hair. He had been held by people before. He had shaken more hands than he could count, had been hugged at charity events and business dinners and family occasions by people he mostly didn't know well enough for the contact to mean what it was supposed to mean. He had touched and been touched in all the transactional ways that life required. This was not that. This was something that went past all of his training in staying measured and contained and appropriately distant, past every carefully maintained boundary between his interior life and the world outside it, and landed in a part of him that he had not known was still accessible. He did not move his hand. He stood there with Marisol's hand in his and watched Big eat and felt something unlocking in his chest with the slow, inevitable quality of a tide. He heard footsteps on the grass behind them, Sophia's footsteps, which he had learned to recognize without knowing he was learning them. She came to stand beside Marisol and looked at her daughter, and then at him, and then at their joined hands. He watched her face make a journey that she let him see. The surprise, the moving through the surprise, the thing that came after it.
Hi, she said. Hi, he said.
Big is a he, Marisol reported, to cover the silence. Sophia laughed, a real laugh, a small one, surprised out of her. It was the first time he had heard her laugh like that, without any management of it. It changed her face in a way that did something immediate and irreversible to his ability to remain uninvested. They stood at the lily pond in the July evening, all three of them, for a long time without needing to say anything that the silence wasn't already saying. He had asked her to dinner a week later. Not as an employer. Not ambiguously. Clearly and directly, in the hallway outside his office, with the slight stiffness of someone doing something they haven't done in long enough that it feels new, saying that he would like to take her to dinner if she was interested, and that he understood completely if she wasn't, and that it would not affect her employment in any way, and that he was, and here he had stopped, and something in his face had softened below the formality, and he had said more quietly that he was not good at this historically. But he thought it might be worth being bad at it for a while if she was willing to be patient with him. She had looked at him for a long moment. He had not been able to read her face, which was unusual. He read most people easily, had built a career partly on it. But Sophia looked back at him with that steady, dark-eyed gaze that had always given him slightly less than he was looking for, and he had been standing there waiting for her answer with the vulnerable, unguarded quality of someone who has already decided to care about the outcome. "I'll be patient with you," she had said. And then, before he could say anything, "But only if you're patient with me too. I haven't done this since Marco. I'm probably also bad at it." "Then we'll be bad at it together," he said. And he had almost smiled, and she had almost smiled, and Marisol had appeared from around the corner of the hallway and asked if anyone had seen her green crayon, and the moment had resolved itself with the slightly comic relief that small children provided to large emotional developments. The dinner was in August. And then there were others. And between the dinners, there were mornings at the lily pond and evenings in the kitchen, and a Tuesday in September when Marisol turned 4 and Sophia had brought a small cake to the estate thinking it would be just the two of them, and had found that Mrs. Chun had quietly coordinated a small celebration that included Gerald, who had made his own contributions to the dessert table without being asked, and the landscape crew, who had fashioned a banner out of materials that suggested significant improvisation. And Ethan had been there. He had been there with a gift that Marisol had not yet specified wanting but which nonetheless turned out to be exactly right. A set of artist-grade washable markers in 24 colors, in a wooden box, with a small card that said for all the things that need to be made pretty. Sophia had read the card and looked at him with the unguarded, full-faced look that she had been letting him see more of lately, and he had looked back at her with everything he still didn't know how to say in words but was learning, slowly, to let his face carry. There were still things they were navigating. The distance he had to keep unlearning. The walls she had to keep choosing to walk through. The shape of what they were building, which didn't have a clear blueprint and required a kind of willingness to work without one that he found both uncomfortable and, increasingly, genuinely good for him. Marisol, who had absorbed all of this with the equanimity of someone who had never been presented with a version of reality that didn't include both of them, continued to issue directives about the garden, dominate the kitchen island on Tuesday mornings, and draw pictures that went on walls.
There were 3 of them in his office now.
The original dragon in the garden, still against the lamp. A newer piece, a family of stick figures labeled in Marisol's developing handwriting, which translated to Mama, Ethan, and me, the letters mostly correct and very large. And a third piece, the most recent, which showed what might have been a house, might have been the estate, with a sky full of stars and 3 figures standing in the garden. On the night she had given him that last drawing, Marisol had stood in his office doorway with her hands behind her back and told him it was the house where they lived. He had looked at Sophia, who was behind Marisol in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed, watching him with that particular expression, the one that looked like patience and tenderness and something that had gotten past all her careful management. "Where we live," he'd said. Marisol nodded. "All of us," she confirmed, with the absolute authority of someone stating a simple fact about the world. He had looked at the drawing. He had looked at Marisol. He had looked at Sophia, and she had not looked away, and in her face he had seen the thing he had been watching grow there for months, clear and warm and as steady as she was, as real as the child standing in his doorway with her hands behind her back, as real as the day a small girl had put a ruined shirt in a sink and tried with everything she had to wash it clean. He had set the drawing carefully on the desk. He had looked at all 3 of them together in the lamplight, the dragon, the family, the house with its stars. He had thought about what he'd built. The companies, the estate, the reputation, the careful machinery of a life designed for efficiency and insulated from risk. He had thought it was enough. He had spent a very long time not knowing what enough was missing. He looked at the doorway, at the woman leaning in it, watching him with her whole face, at the child who had drawn him a house and called it theirs.
"Come in," he said.
And they did. Some houses are built from stone and glass. The ones that last are built from something else, from small hands trying to fix what they've broken, from a woman who holds her head up in every room she walks into, from the slow, brave work of letting another person in. It takes longer to build those houses, but they don't fall down.